continue with more input on self-learning practices.
I get described on the website, I've been described on the website as an educational anarchist. It's a bit of a scam with choosing that phrase. I came to use that as a phrase that described who I was and what I did, because my second daughter, who at the time was 7, sat in a Northampton coffee shop and had a conversation with a very bearded resident of that town. And he listened very patiently, and at the end of it said, "You're basically just educational anarchists, aren't you?" And yeah, I stole it. But it's not far off from what we do as a family, from the way that we look at how we format ourselves and we behave, and the opportunities that we offer our children and their friends, parents and their families. And it's a practice that's become known as autonomous education. Regardless of the name, it's possibly the best way of describing what all education should be. It's expansive, it's open. It encompasses every possible variety under the sun. As long as that is, as it has the individual, who in most cases, from our purposes, is a child. We're generally talking about people under the age of 17, because in this country we have a law that says your parents have a duty to provide you with an education by attendance at school or otherwise. And by the way, school is legally defined as a state institution, so if you didn't go to a state school, you count as otherwise. So you're in the same group as me, sorry. But the whole point is that we're talking about children. And this, in a way, because autonomous education is highly successful, it is highly individual, it is about what the child chooses to do, following their interests. And yes, as parents, we do actually do quite a lot towards provision. There's a term we use called strewing. If you have any sort of agricultural background, or any sort of understanding of history, particularly medieval practices and the way that reed floors were laid out and kept refreshed, and pleasant places to be if you were a wealthy household and could afford a reed floor, you strewed it. It means that you gather up the resources, you gather up material and new matter, and you leave it around, you spread it around. It's there to be found, to be discovered. And as a parent, when you strew in an autonomous educational environment, you are leaving a lot of stuff about. And in many ways, that was perhaps easier pre-web, because you went to the library, you picked up a book, you brought it home. You spend money in Oxfam with second-hand books. You found all sorts of practices and ways to provide information. There's an awful lot of people out there now from whom the concept of strewing is, yes, Wikipedia. It's really useful, but the best thing about that is you don't have to take them to Wikipedia. You show them, you allow them to develop the computer skills so that they can make the searches for themselves, so that they can identify information that they need. And I'd love actually to know if Wikipedia has any data on how many of its editors started under 18 and started with a background in home education. That'd be quite an interesting figure to have, I think. But as I said, this is a format of education that the establishment are really quite scared of. Because if we're successful when we don't go to school, when we take a bloody great sledgehammer to the great lie that says that school is compulsory, it's not. Education is. And indeed the provision of it is. Parents have a duty to provide an education. There is no obligation on the part of the child to take that education up. I know almost no children, unless those who have been to school and been really quite scarred by the experience, who don't. I don't know a single home educated child who's not interested in what they do. To an awful lot of people, it maybe looks like they're spending 24/7 on Minecraft. But most of the people in this room know all the things that you can actually get from spending a lot of time on a site like that. The problem we have with the way that the establishment treats us is that often the establishment is about equality of outcome. It is not about openness. You end up in a situation where you get a race to the bottom, not a race to the top. So then when you have a group of people who are other, and we're not running to the bottom of the pile, we're not seeking an outcome that looks like everybody else's for our children, it shows it up. Educational institutions, I don't believe, this is my opinion, it may not be borne out by fact, it may not be borne out by your opinion, it's mine, don't exist to provide education. They exist to provide state-subsidised childcare, to keep children off the streets, to keep their parents free and available to take up work. So when you choose to autonomously educate, quite often as a household you are removing yourselves, or at least one person in that household, from that workforce, from that availability to work, certainly to work in a way that provides taxation, to work in a way that leads to compliance. And in this, I say that home education and the way that we do it and the way that it needs to be recognised is it's a highly feminist practice. It's also a practice in which you will see children from backgrounds that don't traditionally achieve university often go on to do so. Children from poor backgrounds, and this is borne out by research, it's the University of Durham study, which concluded in 2002 and indeed led to the PhD and the postgraduate work for its producer, found that children from poor backgrounds, from those backgrounds where their own parents had not achieved what was considered a basic education in this country, which was measured as 4 Cs, or indeed 4 grades of any kind at O-level, CSE or GCSE. Those children outperformed their school-going peers to the point where there was no difference between those children and the middle-class children who would also have been in that classroom. In a home learning environment, middle-class children also outperform their school-going peers. It's less obvious. I have a theory about this as well, because I think that if you take the costs that we are made to spend by going to school, the school run, the uniform, the cost of additional food, the cost of classes that the school will land on you, trips, if you take that money out of the pot, out of telling you where to spend it, it goes back into the family pot. And it is inevitably then spent on the education of those children. Those children are then able to access things that we all see as middle-class people as the things our kids just go and do whether they go to school or not. And those children get those things into their background. They often then go into home education groups and then achieve other things as well. Because one of the things about home education is it is a community as well as an individual practice. So this is kind of the point where I came to the end of what I've written and thrown out and written and thrown out and written and thrown out. I've been iterating on this all day. But I found myself agreeing quite strongly with other speakers you've had this evening because I'm referencing the same thing. I only read The Diamond Age last year. A friend of mine went to work for a software company which is literally 200 metres in that direction and was founded entirely on the principles of the book in The Diamond Age. To write software that would recreate the situations in which that book, which would learn with the child and create a connection between the child and other parts of the web, primarily at the moment relating to learning mathematics and software practices, but they have plans to move on to other things. One of the things I think is very interesting about this company is that it's Chinese owned. And when you delve into the way that the Chinese state is actually supporting education, you will see that this is very much a direction that they are moving in, and in fact they're 10 years into it. It's a direction that in the UK we've barely touched on yet. Home education, particularly autonomous education or an anarchist education, creates people who are self-directed learners. It creates them capable of taking an idea, a subject matter, of grasping it, of going off and doing the reading, doing the learning, reading the manual. Oh, that was so tempting to actually use the phrase then. But it takes those people and it puts them into a situation which is actually a way that universities like to get them. They don't develop the habits that says the teacher is always right. And home educated children, or particularly autonomously educated children, routinely go to university. Routinely. The reason they don't show up on those figures is that often they're not in home education for the entirety of their time. Quite often, and this was a study done by Cambridge as part of their looking into early years and educational aspect, when they talk to their own students, when they actually ask those students about their primary education, they discovered that something like 8% of the students in a particular year, a particular cohort, which was 2002, 8% of those children did not attend an institution of learning before the age of 13. That was the norm for the vast majority of certainly Cambridge students until roughly the 1930s. You stayed at home, you had a governess, you learnt from your parents, and then you went to school in preparation for university, which is why they were called prep schools. I think that autonomous education is something that we need to look at quite seriously. Because it's child-led, it does not mean that child doesn't go to school. I went to school. I was incredibly lucky in that I got through school before the national curriculum hit. And to be honest, my entire experience of being in a school situation was that I pretty much did what I liked. I learnt what I liked when I liked it. I had a maths teacher who somehow managed to teach us Hamlet's soliloquy and quadratic equations in 2 hours one afternoon. I still don't remember how I learnt to do quadratic equations, but I do remember that he stood up there and intoned Shakespeare. And he was bearded and large and round and sounded a lot like, I now know, Brian Blessed. It wasn't him. But autonomous education is, because it's individual, because it's self-directed, you will find people who do it by spending all their time on Minecraft, reading all the books in the library, sitting at home, finding resources, fixing grammar on Wikipedia, going on to then editing those articles, moving on to other things. You will find it in people who go on to study at really quite high levels, as we consider it, postgraduate and postdoc. There are a number of people working out there in postdoctoral things who are working that way. And as such, I would argue that home education is something, or particularly autonomous education, is something that we all actually need to look at and to think about as a way to move everybody forward. To almost take those of us who are other and make us the norm. To accept that we're there as a resource and that we can be called upon by others. And that there are more of us than you think. Last note. In the UK, there are around 50,000 children who are currently not within the state or the private schooling systems. Some of those children are at the very democratic schools, at places like Summerhill, or Rees Farn, or Fraser, or within the small, now free schools in places like Fendhorn. They account for something in the region of 5,000. We are the families, the children that appear in the statistics and they say they're NEETs. We don't know, but we're not NEETs. We're still in education. They just don't know what we're doing. You kind of need to remember that those are the people that big ideas come from. I'm not saying that big ideas won't come from anyone else, but I am arguing that you need to accept that as a resource we're here, we can be called upon. And the reports you might read in the press of our demise or our uselessness, of our ill-thought-out ideas, are probably inaccurate and were probably written by someone who went to school.